Hello. This video is an episode in a broader series covering the story of Western philosophy. Now, recently in this series, we've taken a bit of an esoteric detour, covering ideas that are not traditionally taught in mainstream philosophy courses. We've covered the mystery cults of ancient Greece and the teachings of Zarathustra. Today, we are going to be covering a subject that is quite intimidating to try and distill into one fluid, coherent YouTube video. We will be discussing Hermetic philosophy, a categorization of ideas that are often neglected but have had a major impact on Western thought and mainstream culture today. Understanding Hermetic thought, in my estimation, is important context if we wish to make sense of the Western intellectual developments we will soon discuss, the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics, for example. But its influence doesn't stop there. It has trickled through the ages, impacting thinkers like Newton and Hegel. And of course, there are ideas within Hermetic philosophy that are worthy of respect in their own right. But before I dive into this part of our story, I want to provide a disclaimer. Researching this subject was like wading through a swamp. The topic is dominated in much of the online sphere by modern mystics and esotericists. There's a lot of questionable commentary on the subject. I ultimately turned to getting my hands on what Hermetic texts I could, only to find that different Hermetic texts contradict one another, something we will soon discuss further. Take the Emerald Tablet, for example. That's one of the most famous Hermetic texts. There are quite a few different translations of the Emerald Tablet, with no definitive arguments for treating one of them as authoritative. We don't know which translation was the most correct. On top of that, there's a bunch of different interpretations of those different translations. So of course there's going to be plenty of valid debate on this subject. This video should be viewed as an introduction to these ideas, focused on their future influence on Western philosophy. In this episode, I have decided to rely heavily on the book The Egyptian Hermes by Garth Fowden, along with a few others and quotes from the Hermetica itself. If you disagree with the following interpretations, as some of you who are well versed in Hermetic philosophy justifiably may, take it up with Fowden. Occasionally throughout human history, individuals are born with the ability to seemingly bend its course to their wills. Alexander the Great was one such man, a man tutored by Aristotle himself, a man who basked in the glory of Diogenes the Cynic. What is important to us here is that he conquered much of the known world and began, or really furthered, a process of Hellenization that would alter its history. One such place was the Nile Valley. This was a pivotal moment in Egyptian history. From then on, the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt would never again be worn by a native pharaoh. After Alexander died, people would swarm the power vacuum he left behind. His men would divide up his kingdom, declaring themselves kings of their respective territories, and they would clash in a great series of wars. Egypt came under the control of one of these men. Meanwhile, Rome was on the rise, and its legions would sweep across the world, eventually conquering the Nile Valley themselves. They too would spread some Greek culture across their domain. Fowden writes, "In the centers of power, Hellenism was triumphant. But in cultural terms, Egyptianism, instead of being submerged by Hellenism, exercised so strong a gravitational and assimilative pull on it that the product of their interaction was at least as much Egyptian as Greek. Nowhere was this truer than in matters of religion. Before and after Alexander, much of the Greek and later Roman world admired the Egyptians greatly. The Egyptians were commonly viewed as the first people to organize formal religious cults, and as we have discussed, cults in the ancient world were just as important to the intellectual tradition as philosophers. They had great influence. So we may not find this point so significant, but it was very significant to the Greek and Roman world. The Egyptian priesthood was well respected for their knowledge. Many of the Greek heroes of thought we have discussed traveled great lengths to learn from them. People like Solon, Thales, Pythagoras, Democritus, and even Plato. The point is that Egyptian culture was not completely dominated or looked down on by the conquering civilizations, which is necessary information to set the stage for the emergence of Hermetic philosophy. Hermetic philosophy is of Greco-Egyptian descent. Greek and Egyptian interaction obviously predated Alexander, but when Alexander conquered the Nile Valley, there was a pivotal mixing of cultures that would create the soil from which Hermetic philosophy would truly blossom. I should add that some additionally credit Judaism and Zoroastrianism with having an influence. So this was the soil. Hermetic philosophy was the plant, but what of the roots? The roots of Hermetic philosophy go back to the separate religious traditions of each civilization, particularly the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. The connection between these two gods was made by the civilizations at the time. It isn't something we impose on the past. There was a lot of mixing of worship between these two cultures when they came together, where they tried to make sense of each other's religions by finding connections between their gods. And so these gods would blend together for some of them as if they were the same figure. Which brings us to the founding father of Hermetic philosophy, Hermes Trismegistus, a man who was said to have taught the Egyptians all their knowledge of natural and supernatural things. Hermes Trismegistus emerged as a mythologized figure from the syncretism of Thoth and Hermes. He was the Hellenistic Hermes, Egyptianized through his assimilation to Thoth. Hermetic philosophy is derived from a large corpus of Hermetic texts, commonly called the Hermetica, all of which are said to be authored by the great Hermes himself. But in actuality, it appears that the Hermetica is a large collection of books authored by different writers across a long span of time that all collectively credited their work to the same name. A myriad of people bore the title. Foucault says, Hermes Trismegistus did not exist, but the fact that several texts have been placed under the same name indicates that there has been established among them a relationship of homogeneity, filiation, authentication of some texts by the use of others, reciprocal explication, or concomitant utilization. The author's name serves to characterize a certain mode of being of discourse. The fact that the discourse has an author's name, that one can say, this was written by so-and-so and so-and-so is the author, shows that the discourse is not ordinary everyday speech that merely comes and goes, not something that is immediately consumable. On the contrary, it is a speech that must be received in a certain mode, and that in a given culture must receive a certain status. So the name gave the writing divine importance in the culture in which it existed. It bound the works together in a way that allowed them to legitimize one another, building a corpus greater than its parts. Fowden writes, Hermes is a mortal who receives revelations from the divine world and eventually himself achieves immortality through self-purification, but remains among men in order to unveil to them the secrets of the divine world. It is significant how many of the philosophical Hermetica are presented in epistolary or dialogue form. In this way, the Hermetist, while preserving the divine and revelatory character of his doctrines, imparts to their exposition a certain air of historical reality, stirring in his audience perhaps echoes of Socrates and his circle as depicted in the Platonic dialogues. Yet if once Hermes had been a mortal, that had long been in a remote antiquity, and he had long since been assumed into the company of the gods. The technical Hermetica are studiously vague, usually envisaging Trismegistus as a sage who lived in a remote period and conversed freely with the gods, though on occasion they speak of him as a divine being. So the totality of the works attributed to Hermes is called the Hermetica, and it's generally split into two categories today, the technical Hermetica and the philosophical Hermetica. The technical Hermetica covered subjects like astrology, alchemy, magic, and other occult sciences, while the philosophical Hermetica covered philosophy. I'll cover the technical Hermetica briefly, since I know you're all uninterested in learning how to do magic. To paraphrase Fowden, he says, the intellectual distinctiveness of the technical Hermetica is best appreciated not so much by comparing them with other pseudo-anonymous orientalizing literatures, like the teachings of Zarathustra, for example, to which they are very similar, but in relation to the conventional Greek and Roman science. The technical Hermetica built on the investigation and classification of phenomena that had been the hallmark of Aristotelian science. But to this practical streak, the technical Hermetica adds a belief in universal forces that are not empirically investigable, yet capable of being tuned to man's advantage once access has been gained to the necessary occult knowledge. There is a divine realm, and there is this notion that all phenomena in the divine and material realms alike are linked together by sympathetic powers or energies into one pleroma. God is one and the creator of all things, which continue to depend on God as elements in a hierarchy of beings. Second in the hierarchy after God himself comes the intelligible world, and then the sensible world. The creative and beneficent powers of God flow through the intelligible and sensible realms to the sun, which is the demiurge around which revolve the 8 spheres of the fixed stars, the planets, and the earth. From these spheres depend the daemons, and from the daemons man, who is a microcosm of creation. Thus everything is part of God, and God is everything, his creative activity continuing unceasingly. All things are one, and the pleroma of being is indestructible. The divine powers that bind this closely knit structure together are sometimes called energies, and may also be spoken of in terms of light. These energies derive from the sun, the planets, and the stars, and they operate on all bodies, whether immortal or mortal, animate or inanimate. They are what causes growth, decay, and sensation, and they are also the origin of the arts arts and the sciences, and every other human activity. By establishing sets of sympathetic correspondences or chains, they maintain affinity between the most disparate areas of the natural realm, so that each animal, plant, mineral, or even part of the human or animal body corresponds to a particular planet or god whom or which they can be used to influence, provided the right procedures and formulae are known. So let's get into something more specific. Let's talk about alchemy. Fowden writes, "Alchemy was the art by which base metals were supposed to be transmuted into silver and gold. But while the alchemist's practical techniques were rooted in the monastic skills of the jeweler, the glassmaker, and such like, his theoretical pretensions touched ultimately on the human soul and its relationship to God. An interest in imitating the appearance and color of precious metals evolved gradually into a habit of thinking of metals as composed of a lifeless physical base, or body, and an invigorating principle, or soul, which imparted character and distinctiveness to the physical base. The physical base was the same for all metals, but the soul was present in varying degrees of purity, hence the different characteristics of each metal and the belief that it was possible to transmute base metals into gold by manipulating the soul. But the same distinction between the body and soul of metals stimulated in some alchemists another, more analogical line of thought, which used alchemical imagery in order to describe the purification of the human soul and its ascent to its divine source, so that a physical process became a generative symbol of a spiritual experience. The alchemists themselves were philosophers, and the aim of their philosophy, or divine art, was the dissolution of the body and the separation of the soul from the body. So the study of alchemy was intertwined with the ideas of the philosophical Hermetica, which basically we'll cover in a bit, but it lays out a philosophy that teaches its initiates how to achieve salvation through unification with the divine Nous, or God, through a process of ritual practice and spiritual study. Alchemy for the Hermeticists we are concerned with, then, below the physical surface of its practice, is ultimately concerned with ascending and achieving that unification with Nous, that transcendent wisdom or experience. It should be said, though, alchemy is often referred to as being Hermetic, of Hermetic science, philosophy, or art. An alchemical practice will develop and diversify as time goes on, and there are different understandings of alchemy that clearly diverge from Fowden's interpretation, and those divergent ideas will still be referred to as Hermetic sometimes. So I feel like I should cover some of the other interpretations of alchemy. A lot of different books you will read will treat alchemy like a monolith, and yet they'll have completely different interpretations of what that monolith was. I think it's a better analysis to say that different alchemists had different views and intentions. For a few participants, it was surely just a physical curiosity, important experimentation, early attempts to see how material could be manipulated and what that tells us about material reality. And different people had different materialist theories. Many later alchemists would adopt the Empedoclean or later Aristotelian idea that there are four fundamental elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and everything is a mixture of these elements. So there must be some means of altering the mixture and thus changing something like lead into gold. Their approach was not the same as every other alchemist. Seemingly, there were those who viewed it as purely a tradition of spiritual concern. It is a discourse on a series of principles veiled behind these cryptic alchemical explanations and processes. It wasn't about the physical processes at all. Not that the physical processes were not the central concern, but that they didn't engage in any physical processes, period. They just used them as metaphors. Additionally, this is less relevant to what we are concerned with in this video, but I feel I must mention it. The Kabbalion, which was published in 1908 and written by a man of that time period, making it very much not a part of the Hermetica that we are concerned with, claims to contain the teachings of Hermes. This book has been massively influential on the sphere of people today who claim to believe in Hermetic philosophy. This variant of Hermetic philosophy is certainly worthy of interest, but their perspectives are going to differ from the earlier Hermetists, and they believe that everything is vibrational. From that perspective, the interpretation of alchemy may differ. Some may believe that you just have to alter the vibration of a particular mineral in order to change it. Later, Jung would write extensively about alchemy being primarily a psychological phenomenon, an exploration of the unconscious. The alchemical tradition became a big source of inspiration to him. All sorts of people with a variety of these different perspectives have declared themselves students of Hermeticism. I think it's important to clarify that when we say Hermeticism is this or alchemy is that. It would be inappropriate to completely ignore all those other views, but the explanation Fowden describes is, in my estimation, the most true to the Hermetica itself, which is what we care about here. Now let's talk about astrology. Fowden says, the Hermetists believed that the stars played a crucial role in the dissemination of divine energies throughout the universe, and in the related workings of cosmic sympathy or fate. So the stars themselves played a significant part in shaping how reality played out. This complex of beliefs, and by extension their religious dimension to be discussed here, was a characteristic product of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, for while such general notions as cosmic sympathy, fate, and even the influence of the stars on human affairs can be traced in ancient Egypt and classical Greece, the fundamental presupposition of astrology, namely the belief in a direct and calculable connection between the planetary movements and human actions, first emerged in the aftermath of Alexander's conquest, through a fusion of Greek with Egyptian and Babylonian ideas effected principally by the Stoics. The Hermeticists described the heavens before our world came into being. The ordering of the heavenly bodies is superior to that of our world below. It is immovable for all time and transcends human understanding, and so the lower world was seized with fear and sighed before the extraordinary beauty and eternal stability of the things above. For it was truly a worthy object of contemplation and of mental struggle to see the beauty of the heavens presenting a reflection of the God as yet unknown, and the sumptuous majesty of the night adorned with a clear light, though one less than that of the sun, while the other mysteries move severally amidst the heavens according to fixed movements and periods of time, ordering and nourishing the lower realm through certain secret affluences. So many astrologers believed that man's highest aspiration in this life, if he happens to be endowed with a kingly soul, is to contemplate the stars and commune with them, separated for a time from his bodily envelope. Astrology, like alchemy, was distinctly spiritual because everything was interconnected. It's not uncommon to hear people discuss that experience of transcendence and unification with the divine through something like meditation. There's enough reports of that it would be inappropriate to simply dismiss it as complete nonsense. But it's very interesting to hear someone treat astrology or studying the stars as a means towards that. The technical Hermetica covers other things like magic and demonology, but I think that is enough of a foundation to jump into our central concern, the philosophical Hermetica. Again, the philosophical Hermetica lays out a philosophy that teaches its initiates how to achieve salvation through unification with the divine Nous or God through a process of ritual practice and spiritual study. There is a quest for this divine vision which is only granted to those who are reborn. Rebirth can be brought about only by divine action. Neither reason in general nor specifically the Hermetic discourse can of itself bring one to the truth. The logos guides the intellect as far as a certain point, but thenceforth the intellect must proceed on its own, with nothing but reminiscence of the teachings it has received in the sphere of reason to compare its experiences with. Through this manner the intellect may eventually attain to faith. There is episteme, reason, and then there is gnosis, which is divine knowledge. Gnosis is the goal of episteme, a transition that the way of Hermes brings about. The knowledge of God's creation is an essential preliminary to knowledge of God himself. The philosophical understanding, knowledge of the universe or God's mind, is a preliminary for the higher divine enlightenment that cannot be put into words. One of the Stoian fragments writes, "Without philosophy it is impossible to be perfectly pious. He who learns of what nature things are and how they are ordered, and by whom, and to what end, will be thankful for all things to the Creator, as to a good father, a kindly fosterer, and a faithful guardian. He who is thankful will be a pious man, and the pious man will know where and what truth is, and through this knowledge will become still more pious." So the Hermetists viewed knowledge of the origin and nature of the world as an essential preliminary to spiritual illumination. To know the stages of creative process is also to know the stages of one's own return to the root of all existence. Man's crippling disability was his ignorance, and the Hermetist's highest aspiration was to overcome that ignorance, and by helping man to understand his true nature, bring him at last to know God and assert his own divinity. So to try and reduce it to something simple, to provide you a roadmap for the way of Hermes, the first goal is to escape ignorance through philosophical study. You ought to learn about God, his creation, and harmonious nature. Astrology would be the perfect example. You ought to then seek to understand the metaphysical, to study the emanations of being that have led to your current state. What you are experiencing, the sensible realm, is not the totality of reality. It is but an emanation. Through understanding this hierarchy of being, the process of emanations, you will learn how to return to the root of existence, how to reunify with God. A way of studying this would be alchemy. Then after we have escaped the shackles of ignorance, we can finally achieve Gnosis. But Gnosis is not achieved through the power of the intellect. That can only take you so far. Hermes says, the mysteries of the spirit are not taught, but we are reminded of them by God when he wishes. And finally, at the end of Asclepius, Hermes says, the way of Hermes was not for the mind alone, nor did the attainment of episteme or even Gnosis provide an automatic access to salvation. You weren't saved the moment you experienced Gnosis. No, the pious fight consists in knowing the divine and doing ill to no man. So living an ethical life plays an important role in achieving salvation. When it comes to the precise nature of that last part, the role of a pious life in achieving salvation, there are conflicting statements throughout the Hermetica. At times, certain writing seems very life-affirming, but then at other times it's more like Gnosticism or like Plato before his death. It can go back and forth between those two views. So rather than making assertions myself, I'll just quote Fowden as saying, the intending initiate must lead a life of piety, obedience, and purity, that is, abstinence from the pleasures of this world. Now let's end it with Hermes Prophecy, because I find that interesting. Hermes called Egypt the image of heaven, the focus of celestial energies, the temple of the whole world. And yet a time will come when it will seem that the Egyptians have in vain honored God with pious heart and assiduous devotion, and all holy reverence for the gods will become ineffective and be deprived of its fruit. For God will return from earth to heaven, and Egypt will be abandoned. It is Egypt whose doom is foretold, while the gods merely withdraw to heaven, from whence they will return to earth after its purification by flood, fire, or plague. And even then, when all things will be new, Egypt will still be the true home of the gods. The tragedy of Egypt, then, is a parenthesis within eternity, a temporary departure of the gods from earth before the return of the golden age. But in human terms, the catastrophe is ineluctable. What precisely is to be its nature? In the first place, foreigners, barbarians will entirely fill the country, and the ancient temple cults and rituals will not only be neglected, but actually forbidden. Egypt will be filled with the tombs of the dead, the Nile will be swollen with blood and overflow, and the whole country will be left a desert. As for anyone who survives, only by his language will he be recognized as an Egyptian. In his way of behavior he will seem an alien. Men will be reduced to total despair, and of this state of mind Hermes provides a most remarkable description. In that day men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the world worthy of reverent wonder and worship. This whole good thing, then, which nothing was, or is, or will be deemed better, will be threatened with destruction. Men will think it a burden, and will come to scorn it. They will no longer love this world around us, this incomparable work of God, this glorious structure, this sum of good made up of things of many diverse forms. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. No one will raise his eyes to heaven. The pious will be deemed insane, and the impious wise. The madman will be thought brave, and the wickedest will be regarded as good. Only the evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches by main force into all manner of reckless crimes, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Then will the earth no longer stand unshaken, and the sea will no longer be navigable. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits, nor will the stars pursue their constant course in heaven. The voice of the gods will of necessity be silenced and dumb. The fruits of the earth will rot, the soil will turn barren, and the very air will sicken in sullen stagnation. I include this prophecy because I like to end my videos with a hopeful message, and according to Hermes, we have a lot to look forward to. I'm gonna go do some reckless crime now.